Major General Murray-Lyon of the 11th Indian Infantry Division sat at his command post in the Malayan town of Jitra. All around him, the wail of battle was growing louder, getting closer. The ground shook with the thundering roar of encircling Japanese tanks. His men, exhausted, wounded, and scattered, were slowly being driven back by the overwhelming tide of enemy forces. The Japanese, relentless and organized, pressed forward, closing in from every direction. Murray-Lyon's fingers clenched the map, his mind racing. Falling back to Gurun, about 50 kilometers south of Jitra, was his lifeline, the only chance to save his men. He had informed his commanding officers of the need for an immediate retreat. Their response still hadn't come. His troops were waiting, desperate for direction. Minutes dragged by, stretching into an unbearable wait. Finally, the radio crackled to life. His heart sank as the order came through, quote, "No retreat. Hold the position at Jitra. Fight on." The words cut through him like a blade. There was no escape. The battle at Jitra would be their last stand. The night of December 8th, 1941, found Major General David M. Murray-Lyon staring at a map, his fingers tracing the muddy lines of his division's defenses at Jitra. Far to the north, Japanese forces had already secured the strategic towns of Singora and Patani in Thailand. Now, they were heading south into Malaya, with Jitra, a town on the main road into the peninsula, marked as their next target. For Murray-Lyon and his 11th Indian Division, the situation was grim. Their defenses were incomplete, and his men, strained by long hours of preparation, poor weather, and unfamiliar terrain, were about to face an enemy that had already proven its ability to move swiftly and decisively. The British had long been aware of the Japanese threat. Early in 1941, British planners devised two potential options for the defense of Malaya. The first, Operation Matador, would send troops into Thailand to preemptively strike at Japanese forces, but the operation never materialized due to logistical issues and the slow movement of troops. The second plan was to establish defensive lines in northern Malaya, including at Jitra. This defensive line was a fallback option, and it lacked many of the necessary elements: anti-tank weapons, integrated units, and strong fortifications. The tropical rain and constant mud made the terrain nearly impassable, and the division's men, many of whom were untrained for jungle warfare, struggled to adapt to the brutal conditions. By the time the Japanese launched their southward assault on December 8, 1941, Operation Matador had been abandoned, and the focus shifted entirely to the defense at Jitra. Orders came down to Murray-Lyon and the 11th Indian Division: hold the line at all costs. The Japanese 5th Division was moving quickly, using tanks, artillery, and air support to decimate any resistance. The infantry, trained in the art of combined arms, advanced with ruthless efficiency, exploiting every weakness in the British defenses. If the Allies blew up a road or bridge on their enemy's path, the Japanese made swift use of their engineers to rapidly repair the damaged infrastructure, giving them the mobility and initiative that the Allies sorely lacked. As the first wave of Japanese troops advanced, Murray-Lyon's division scrambled to take their positions, fully aware that their defenses were ill-prepared for what lay ahead. As night fell on December 9th, the rain continued to pour. Meanwhile, Laykal, a 200-strong convoy from the 1/8th Punjab Regiment under Major Eric Robert Andrews, pushed up the trunk road from Jitra with two 2-pounder anti-tank guns and combat engineers. By 9 p.m. on that day, Laykal set up positions across the Thai border at Ban Sadao. Just then, the vanguard of the Japanese 5th Division came hurtling down the road, lights blazing. Laykal's 2-pounder anti-tank guns fired with fatal precision, knocking out 2 Japanese tanks in quick succession. But the victory was fleeting. With the enemy closing fast, the crew raced to set charges on the bridge supports. Wires were frantically connected, the fuse was lit, and the men bolted for cover. Moments later, a deafening explosion tore through the air, the bridge collapsing in a cloud of dust as the Japanese tanks rumbled closer. They had bought some much-needed time, but it was a fleeting sense of peace and quiet. By dawn on December 10th, the angry roar of Japanese tanks and infantry resumed their disciplined march to Jitra. The British and Indian troops prepared to hold their ground, relying on a network of defensive positions set up hastily along the main road. However, the Allied forces quickly found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer speed and coordination of the Japanese assault. Allied soldiers manned their positions, their rifles shaking in their hands. Explosions rocked the ground as the first tank rounds slammed into the defenses. With every passing minute, the Japanese pushed closer. The British and Indian troops, many of whom had never seen a tank in battle, struggled to adapt. They had been trained to fight conventional open field battles, but the jungle terrain offered no such opportunities for traditional tactics. Mayhem reigned as Punjabi soldiers tried to set up roadblocks and blow up more bridges, desperately trying to slow the Japanese advance. But the enemy was relentless, swiftly repairing roads and bypassing obstacles. With every minute, the Japanese were adapting faster than the defenders could react, closing in on their positions. The Japanese tanks, their thick armor glinting in the early morning light, crashed through more British defenses, impervious to the few anti-tank weapons the Allies had. After tanks rolled over abandoned positions, the infantry flanked the defenders, forcing them to retreat step by step. Each time the British tried to regroup, the Japanese pushed forward. Throughout the rest of the day and night, the sound of artillery and machine gun fire echoed through the jungle. The Allied troops clung to their positions, knowing that they could not afford to give ground easily. As dawn broke on December 11th, the full scale of the Japanese assault became clear. The 5th Division, now reinforced by additional tanks and infantry, was pushing toward the main road, closing in on Jitra. By the morning hours of December 11th, the Japanese had successfully breached key positions along the main road. Jitra was now fully in their sights. Murray-Lyon's forces, now disorganized and outmatched, found themselves fighting a last stand. The 15th Brigade, which had been assigned to defend the most critical stretch of the road, was particularly vulnerable. The 1 Leicesters and 2 9 Jats were hit hardest, as Japanese tanks stormed their positions. Infantry surged forward, rifles firing, while artillery shells rained down, shaking the earth. The British defenders fought tooth and nail, but each wave of enemy troops pushed them back. Tanks barreled through their lines, cutting off retreat, and with every explosion, the defenders' resolve was tested. The battle to hold their ground was slipping away. Brigadier Carpendale, commanding the 15th Brigade, requested reinforcements. 2 companies from the 1/8th Punjab Battalion were sent to support, but miscommunication and friendly fire incidents delayed the reinforcements, leaving the British troops exposed. When the counterattack finally came, it was weak and ineffective. The 1 Leicesters and 2 9 Jats were overwhelmed by the Japanese tanks, which pushed through their lines with frightening efficiency. As the hours wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. The Japanese had broken through the main defensive line, and the British forces were in danger of being completely surrounded. Murray-Lyon's headquarters was overwhelmed with frantic reports. Isolated platoons were surrounded, communication lines severed. Panic spread as the battlefront disintegrated, and the situation grew more dire by the minute. The retreat was becoming inevitable. Murray-Lyon put in the request over the wire, hoping to spare his men any more destruction. Despite this, the Corps commander, concerned about the impact of a retreat on both the morale of the troops and the civilian population, refused to authorize a withdrawal. Murray-Lyon, now facing a rapidly deteriorating situation, knew his division was on the verge of collapse. The fighting raged on without pause. Throughout the afternoon, Japanese forces from the 9th Infantry Brigade attacked from multiple directions. By late afternoon, Murray-Lyon had lost nearly 3 battalions and had no reserve units left to commit to the battle, leaving his forces increasingly vulnerable and unable to mount a significant defense. The British forces, already worn down by the previous day's fighting, lacked the strength to hold. Isolated and disorganized, Murray-Lyon's remaining troops struggled to mount any meaningful resistance. Positions were abandoned, and the Japanese advanced further, exploiting every weakness in the line. Murray-Lyon, desperate, made a final plea for permission to withdraw. By now, the situation had shifted. The battle was lost. Retreat was no longer optional. The Corps commander, recognizing the scale of the disaster, finally relented. With a grim expression, he issued the order to pull back, knowing the cost would be high. The defenses were now crumbling, and the only choice left was to preserve what remained and fall back to regroup. The order to retreat came late on December 12th, the words sinking like stones in the men's hearts. It spread quickly, a mixed wave of relief, dread, and disbelief rippling through the ranks. There was no time for preparation, no clear direction. The withdrawal wasn't a planned maneuver. It was a frantic scramble. Miscommunication tangled up the command structure as soldiers, exhausted from days of brutal fighting, stumbled into the rain-soaked jungle. Units scattered, cut off from one another. Panic set in. The jungle, thick with mud and undergrowth, became a maze of fear. Soldiers, unsure of where to go, tripped over roots, lost their bearings, and vanished into the darkness, alone, unmoored, as the enemy closed in. Japanese forces, sensing the retreat, pressed forward with renewed vigor. Tanks and infantry pushed through the defensive lines, and air support arrived to further demoralize the retreating men. The roads, choked with rain and mud, became a trap. Vehicles lurched, then sank, abandoned in the muck as soldiers cursed in frustration. With every step, the ground sucked at their boots. Weapons, ammunition, supplies, everything they'd fought for was left behind, discarded in the darkness. Every second was a gamble, the air thick with the sound of crashing artillery and the cold dread of the enemy closing in. There was one remaining defensive force to hold their ground with fierce determination. The 2-2 Gurkhas held the rear guard as the rest of the Allies struggled to retreat. Positioned at the bridge over the Sungay-Kadar River, the Gurkhas knew their role was clear: delay the Japanese at all costs. At midnight, Japanese forces launched a desperate assault on the lone bridge over the river Bata. The 2-2 Gurkha rifles, entrenched and resolute, unleashed a devastating volley of fire, repelling the attackers in a brutal clash. But the Japanese kept coming. With seconds to spare, the Gurkhas set the charges and ignited the fuse beneath the river Bata bridge. The seconds felt like hours as the soldiers fled the blast zone. At the last possible moment, they triggered the detonator. The bridge erupted in a violent explosion, sending debris flying into the river. The Gurkhas withdrew through a rearguard formed by the 2 9th Gurkhas, who fended off another savage attack. By 4:30 a.m., the rearguard disengaged, and by noon, the British forces had successfully broken away, leaving the chaos behind as they continued their desperate retreat. The stand had bought precious time, but it came at a brutal cost. When the last of the Gurkhas had pulled back under heavy fire, the battlefield left behind was a grim sight. Abandoned equipment, rifles, ammunition, shattered helmets, littered the ground alongside the fallen soldiers. By the morning of December 13th, what remained of the 11th Indian Division had gathered at Allour Star, a disheartened and fragmented force. The 15th Brigade had been reduced to barely 600 men. The rest of the division had suffered heavy casualties, both in men and material. The Japanese had achieved a crushing victory at Jitra. The hastily mounted defense had snapped like a twig under the weight of relentless pressure, poor preparation, and inadequate training. The Battle of Jitra was a turning point in the Malayan campaign. For Major General Murray-Lyon and his men, it was a stark lesson in the devastating power of Japanese combined arms tactics. The lack of training in jungle warfare, the absence of adequate anti-tank weapons, and the overwhelming speed of the Japanese advance had led to a humiliating defeat. The British forces had been outmaneuvered and outfought at every turn, and the road ahead would be no easier. As Murray-Lyon watched his men regroup, he knew that the retreat from Jitra was only the beginning of a much longer and more brutal struggle in the Malayan campaign. The Japanese were coming, and the fight for Malaya was far from over.